All right, joining me now is, well, I will let him tell what his official title is with Semafor, but he's basically the political guy, is the way I look at it. He's the campaign guy, and Dave Weigel is somebody that I've never worked with, and if I were in the hotline today, I'd like to think Dave Weigel would have been somebody I'd have coerced into coming to the hotline. He's wired like a Cook Report guy, a hotline guy, or Chris Saliza. So, Mr. Weigel, it's good to see you. Good to talk with you.
No, it's great to be here. Thank you for saying that. I am such an original hotline follower that I think I had to download the old hotline videos you did in
I
the
love
early
that you say
aughts.
download. First of all, the videos, that was a separate, that was like John Mercurio and I, totally going,
Yep.
Doing a total ripoff of PTI. And we were doing YouTube, throwing them up there. My old friend of mine, Dan Manat, his dad is Chuck Manat, the late Chuck Manat, in case you're wondering. Dan Manat's a documentarian. It was his idea, and they still live on YouTube. Nothing goes away on YouTube. It sits there forever.
Oh, I remember there was a 9/11 tribute video episode that you released had U2's "Peace on Earth" was the soundtrack. I have the memory that my memory that recalls congressional district names and stuff is very spotty. I can't remember what time meetings start, but I can remember that.
Right.
So big fan. Good to be here.
So it's good to talk with you, and it's sort of we're talking on a Monday, July 28th. The big sort of midterm news of the day is the Roy Cooper announcement in there, but I kind of want to tackle things. We're going to start 60,000 feet, and then we're going to travel the country a little bit. 2017 versus 2025. At this moment in time in 2017, we had the beginning of there's some special election over performances. Democrats hadn't really won anything yet, but it was starting to look, I don't think we had the Connor Lamb special just yet, but it was the Mike Pompeo special. There was a couple of others. And hey, is there something happening out here? You also had a divided Republican Party and a unified Democratic Party. 8 years later, some of this looks similar. We've had some special elections. There's been some overperformance by Democrats. But you have a unified Republican Party for the most part, arguably, and it's a divided Democratic Party. What are you taking away so far in 2025, and how would you compare it to 2017?
I like that setup, and that was one of my jobs at the Post in 2017. Was going to all these districts where the election being held, and Democrats kept coming right up to the end of the race, getting a couple points short of winning. This took me to Montana and to Rock Hill, South Carolina, and yeah, there are a bunch of single-digit races in safe seats. Republicans, the only repetition of history, sort of, was these Florida races that got out of hand, where Democrats raised a ton of money that really not outperformed by much. No, the parties are very different than they were 8 years ago. I was just talking to colleagues about Eric Schmidt, and I was saying, well, he's one in the many lists, the Missouri senator, of Republicans who hold seats that sometimes Trump critics used to hold. There are very few left. We were down to the point where Tom Massey is the most visible Trump critic, and that is a huge shift of the window of what's acceptable in the Republican Party. We all in the media, the universe changes, but we use the same terms like centrist and moderate and pragmatic, et cetera, to define the party. And a moderate Republican at this point is somebody who doesn't really criticize Trump, but maybe votes against some of his nominees sometimes. And 8 years ago, it was somebody like Bob Corker who was trying to slow the agenda down or voting against it. So and they also have a vision of governance, which there are still lots of liberals, I think, who criticize it and say it's all based on Trump's agenda and what his biases were from 20 years ago. He's obsessed with Japan and the trade deficit. They're all in on it. And they also have a vision of the country that is understandable. I could sum up, okay, if Republicans get everything they want, total stop to integration, prices go down for zero-sum reasons. I'm not saying that's right. I'm saying that's what the vision is. A smaller welfare state that you have to work harder to be part of, a foreign policy where we're paying more attention to the Western Hemisphere than to the rest of the world, except when you want a Nobel Peace Prize, you need to bomb Iran. But the Democratic vision, and for all the verbiage they spun about this, their problem is, for the first time since 1980, they had a failed presidency, and they had a chance to try out their version of how the world should work, their vision of what America is. People didn't like it. I don't think they've made peace with that, and I don't think they have a coherent vision that makes sense to people because it's not credible. They just had Joe Biden, the American people. They had a president try Keynesian stimulus in the economy. It led to some inflation. They don't like it. You don't need to overcomplicate it. I think just that
Right.
this is the least credible Democrats have been on a number of areas. And it's not even like whack-a-mole. They have a whack-a-mole board, they're like using the mallet to hit the headboard instead of the moles. They're really not attacking any of the problems they had,
Yeah.
because it would start with saying, like Trump said in 2015, hey, the Republican Party's terrible and it's screwed up, and I'm not going to apologize. I'm just going to make fun of them and say, here's a different vision. They haven't had that. They don't have anyone doing that.
No, I was talking with Saliza earlier today in our weekly pod, and I compared it to, because when you look at the Wall Street Journal poll that I've sort of gone inside out of and just sort of
Yeah.
crawled in every nook and cranny of it, what I see is where two things can be true at the same time, which is the Trump agenda is baggage for the Republican Party, hard stop. A Democratic Party is even more unpopular than the Republican Party right now. What does that mean for the midterms? Well, I go back, and I'm going to go in the Wayback Machine, and my apologies for that, but I'm going to go back to the '86 midterms.
I love the
So
Wayback Machine. Let's hang out there. Yeah.
the '86 midterms are exactly the potential model for Democrats, where they have this success, they win the Senate back. At the time, it was the Senate that was what they thought they could win back. They already had the House. That was back during the middle of their 40-year run. So the Senate was really what the midterms were about. And, they had a front runner presidential candidate at the time in Gary Hart, so that it looked like they were on the march, right? They win the Senate, Hart's candidacy collapses, it turns into a free-for-all, and the Democratic Party gets whacked again, right, by 88. And I could easily see both things happening. Democrats narrowly sort of winning the midterms, right? Getting the House, maybe netting a Senate seat, not quite winning the Senate, but sort of looking like they moved the ball forward, only to see the divides in the party just totally unravel them in 28. So that's a model that I've been, you could picture the Democrats learning the wrong lessons, that their success, when you look at that Wall Street Journal poll, you had a huge majority saying that they don't think Congress is pushing back hard enough on the president. You have unpopularity there. So you see how you can run an anti-campaign and win in the midterms, but it doesn't do anything to improve the Democratic brand going into 28.
Yes, and I was just talking about how that brand is affected by the actual record of the party. I don't think the
Yeah.
Democrats like hearing that, because they'll say, "Well, what was the Trump record in 2020? We had a pandemic,
And he
that
got
botched,
fired.
and he
By
got
the way,
fired.
he got
Yes, that's
fired.
part of it.
Yes, that's
Yeah,
the thing. The public
and
didn't like it. You're right. And guess
and
what? They didn't like you either.
yeah, and Trump came up with something I think basically unrepeatable, which is, well, I was stymied as president, and the deep state stopped me
Right.
from doing what I really would have done, and I could have fixed it, and I'm still eligible to run again, so let me pull this off. And yes, in theory, I suppose Joe Biden is the only living Democrat who could try that. Give me one more shot. That's not going to happen. No, really,
It'll
they
be
have
Hunter
lost some time.
Biden.
Yeah.
Yeah.
uh, but I start with the Democrats' problems because, yeah, I've done my Wayback Machine visit was I read Al Crumb's memoir of creating the Democratic Leadership Council, which when I started out reporting, which really was writing my own stories, 2004, 2005.
Oh, that
Uh,
was at the peak anti-DLC craze.
yes, that was
Yes,
as
you
it
were at
was
the beginning
collapsing.
of that. Yep.
And the mindset at the time, and a lot of this comes from the Democrats' belief in demographic destiny, which they've stopped believing in, was, why do we have to do that? There's a lot of, J.K. Chesterton Spence,
Hmm.
the old analogy. If there's a fence somewhere, you don't know the reason. If you understand why it was put up, you can't just tear it down. There must have been some reason. That's what happened with the DLCs. A lot of Democrats came into the process at the end of the Bush years and said, this is a disaster. There's all these wimpy moderate Democrats or conservative Democrats who voted for the disaster, voted for George W. Bush's war. Why do we do that in the first place? We can build a new majority. Then Barack
Yeah.
Obama did it, and it's 10 years of let's repeat the Obama experiment. Not experiment. Let's repeat the Obama map. We can do it. We can lose by attrition working class voters because they're being replaced over time. That doesn't, and not to get into the entire history of the last couple of years, that's what happened. But the DLC, that book's useful because they were doing things that wouldn't work anymore. It was a very media focused, narrative focused. The narrative, and by narrative I mean it was built for a time when Americans read, basically, if they didn't read or watch the same news outlets, it was understood those news outlets had the power to shape
Mhm.
the storylines. And so what the
And
DLC
news
would do is,
magazines had
and
they were I always
magazines,
said they were the social media of our time. Who was on the
yeah,
cover of Time and Newsweek
yes,
and even US News meant something, both pop culturally
yes.
and politically. Yeah.
And I guess I'm in the media, so obviously I think the media is important. But no, it's every Democrat's trying to figure out how to live in this environment where you can get the most glowing profile of what you did in Time magazine, and it doesn't
Right.
matter because you looked really embarrassing in an online video that got shared a lot of times. So the DLC would have these meetings around the country and say, okay, we've got Bill Clinton, we've got Bruce Babbitt, we've got Mike Dukakis to be part of some of these. Meet these young future Democrats who have new ideas, and reporters would come to them and they meet the Democrats. Donors would come. There was just, you could build a momentum through this discourse, and that discourse has shattered. I mean, we're on a podcast that's another meta
Right.
example of how
All
it's
you
true.
could do, actually, going to go
Yeah.
back if you really wanted to do this, go research every David Broder column and then from
Yeah.
1985 to 1990, and it would
Hmm.
be a parade of new kind of Democrat, new kind of
Hmm.
Democrat, new kind of Democrat,
Yeah.
and it was all about that, and it was all these governors, right? And the Southern
Hmm.
governors, I always say Bill Clinton's presidency was supposed to be Chuck Robb's presidency, right? It
Yeah.
was all the entire delegate selection process, the creation of super delegates, right? The Stop Jesse Jackson movement. It was all designed to help the Southern governors. And at the time, it was LBJ's son-in-law,
Hmm.
Chuck Robb, governor of Virginia, that everybody assumed would be the great beneficiary. Why? Because Chuck Robb lived in the Washington, D.C. media market, is what I always say. So it gave him this sort of perceived leg up on perception.
Hmm.
And then, of course, he turned out not to be a very good politician. This is pre-scandal. Forget,
Hmm.
he just wasn't that good at this. He was he was a resume guy. But Bill Clinton,
Hmm.
and frankly, Michael Dukakis in '88 both benefited from the Super Tuesday organization, which was a total DLC. The
Hmm.
DLC was also tactical. They knew that if they created Southern Super Tuesday, it was a way to insulate them from a super lefty becoming the nominee.
Yes, and that infrastructure obviously is completely different. The media they're operating is completely different.
Mhm.
The fractal I've been paying attention to just see how different this is. Let's isolate one thing Democrats are trying to do. There is a very stop-start conversation they're having about, let's just call it the Biden administration's position on gender and transgender rights.
Mhm.
And the short version, which the New York Times had a very, very long piece based on Scrimeti decisions outcome that gets into this history. But basically, Biden says trans rights should be a civil rights issue of our time. He reverses a lot of the Obama starts to be more accepting of trans people. Gender is a separate category from sex. Trump undoes it. Biden puts it back into effect. Trump unwinds it all, and there's this very stop-start conversation about, did Democrats, was that a mistake? Did Democrats need to rethink this? The way it's being done is that occasionally a Democrat will get asked a question about some aspect of this issue, not the every Biden executive order, but the sports aspect of the issue, and a senator or a congressman will get asked, and they'll say what they think. They'll get piled on by, I'm not trying to be pejorative, but just every group in this space, Human Rights Campaign, um, GLAD, the new groups like the Christopher Street Project will come
Mhm.
in and say, this person is betraying our movement. No one can
Mhm.
lead our party. And also, importantly, they'll say, and they're weak. This is weakness. This is a Democrat
Ugh.
who is responding to defeat by abandoning a section of the party. What won't they abandon? What is next? Um, and I'm not seeing people respond to that by saying I was wrong, or giving a new interview and saying I was completely right. They just don't comment again.
Right.
Ruben Gallego went through this, the senator from Arizona. Seth Moulton went through this, Massachusetts. There's a very good reporter, Oriana Gonzalez, at Notice, who's been doing iterative stories about House Democrats trying to come up with some position, but they're not having the conversation in public. And the DLC had a lot of conversations in public, and this is the hardest one because they're just parents every day affected by this issue. I bring up the hardest one because it's the one that I've seen Democrats touch the stove and pull it away from the fastest. But you could say the same for immigration. Immigration's even stranger because now Pat today, Neritana has a article in the Wall Street Journal about how they're going forward. But there's no Democrat who's come out and said very clearly, "Here's I'm giving a speech at a place where reporters will be." Uh, Biden was a disaster. He let our party down, and he was wrong on immigration. And instead, here is an immigration position that is going to piss off people who believed in one thing in 2020, who believed that, for example, that asylum is a human right, which is a sign that a lot of Democrats campaign behind, literally. They're not doing that. They're trying to sit. I'm going to float something in an interview. I'm going to float something in a podcast. Did anyone notice? Well, hopefully some people notice. It is very hesitant and odd, and you contrast that with Republicans and Trump. Trump can say something, and then there is a discourse around when Trump is saying, do Republicans agree with Trump? Do they not agree with him? He just put out our new position on trade or on
whatever it is,
Gaza
right?
or whatever it is. And it's not like, I think the often question gets asked, oh, well, who's the leader of the party? That's the same with the DLC. You didn't need a leader. You needed just some sort of coherent network that was having a conversation that people understood was a conversation about the party. You also had the progressive, the Jesse Jackson type saying, here's our conversation. Here's our populism. It's just this very atomized selection of groups. And I say this as a reporter, I've just had to build charts of which group says which, because news stories still exist and TV stories still exist. You can only quote so many people, but it's this total post-Tower of Babel cacophony of who stands for what in the party, and very unclear what their position is on anything, because they're not starting with, hey, Biden was wrong. Here's why he was wrong.
Right.
I'm willing to have Mike Donnellan tell me I stink. I'm willing to have Hunter Biden yell at me. Who cares? They're not doing that. They're not confronting that they had a failed presidency.
It's a great point, and it really gets it. And that's the question. I've had this conversation. Have the Democrats lost enough yet to realize they have to change? Right. 84 and 88, they tried to make changes, and yet they didn't say Carter was a failed presidency going into 84. How could they? They nominated the vice president, right? And that was back when labor really was controlling the party, right? Labor was sort of they were the bridge, right? They were the force that sort of brought factions together because they had the money, right? They had the money, and then they could certainly impact primaries. And then the DLC is born basically in 95 after the Mondale shellacking, to sort of stay with your timeline there. And if Hart stays, who was easily sort of the DLC, arguably he was DLC-ish, right? Because he had both, right? He was seen as the guy who ran McGovern's campaign in 72, who was an interventionist and who was like, he was not easily, and he was this sort of Bill Clinton-like figure before Bill Clinton. It looked like he had the ability to bridge the union part of the party and this sort of Western sort of, hey, he's a bit cool, right? He's Warren Beatty's friend, and then he collapses. And then then all the factions came back. Labor decided to, get behind Gephardt in 88 and all this stuff. And it took them, it took two presidential shellackings for them to get religion. And arguably, they didn't even think most of the major figures of the party conceded 92 early on, thinking that was a useless exercise to try to knock off the sitting president. And then lo and behold, Bill Clinton showed that there was a way to do this. I want to pick up on something on immigration, because the Wall Street Journal poll, and I think this is why is Trump's numbers starting to go upside down on immigration? Because there really is two distinct features of the issue. Border security is what people wanted. And that was the massive failure of the Biden administration. And that has been the initial success and what people wanted from Trump.
Yes.
When you ask, and I saw that the Wall Street Journal did a split sample asking Trump's job rating on immigration, and then they did half sample Trump's job rating on illegal immigration. His numbers were better in dealing with illegal immigration. His numbers were worse when it was just immigration. It turns out what the country wanted was they didn't like the chaos at the border.
Yeah.
That didn't mean they wanted to get rid of every migrant in the country. And I think that's the opening here. And ironically, that was the Democratic position under Obama. Right. Tough on the border, lenient on and pathway to citizenship for people already here. And it turned out that's a 55 to 60% agreement message. And for some reason, I go back, it's a debate I moderated. I go back to that first debate where they decriminalized, where everybody on stage but Joe Biden and one other
Yeah.
wanted to decriminalize the border. And you're like, oh my God. It was like they were all high in their own supply in that moment.
Yeah. I think that's the immigration just conversation I'm talking about with Trace before, and how that's gotten further. It's been interesting to watch Frank Sherry, who was at Families USA for a long time, say, yeah, the movement got over its skis on this. And this is one of Trump's strengths, and I'm trying to put it the right way, is sometimes you do something and it's unpopular and it's extreme and it backfires and you're discredited. No one does it again. This is Sam Brown back in Kansas. Republicans still can't win a governor race in Kansas because his tax plan is such a disaster. Trump has done some things that I think have deterred a cause, and nobody's going like Obamacare. It can be hacked away at, but nobody's running on repealing it anymore.
Never going to overturn it, right?
But he's also done some things where his response is so angering to progressives, and it attacks so many of their political, no, just I would say what they think is American, period, that they will overreact. And with immigration, that's what happened. There's a lot of Democrats. The thing you say about 2008, the Democrats in this space, the sort of right to share Matt Iglesias types, they often will say, just go back to 2008, 2012 Obama. He said things the Democrats don't say anymore, and they were popular, and Democrats
Hillary
made
Clinton
mistakes.
voted for a fence.
Right. Oh,
Okay.
Hillary
called a
Hillary
border
Clinton voted for a
fence.
fence?
You could call it a wall. Is it a fence? It's a wall. You know?
Well, read the language in the platform. Because I've talked to some people who are in the Democratic polling and data space who just gone back and looked at anyone can look at the platform language. It's somebody with the time to just do regression and say what words drop out, what words come in. The party just gets much more optimistic about its future and cannot imagine a backsliding, which has already happened, to something that is, let's say, backsliding to a right-wing country. I'm trying not to over-egg what I'm saying. Now, the Trump thing on immigration is he's president. He tries to build a wall. There's Republican division on that. I mean, Tom Tillis, who's retiring, one of the Republicans who complains about him moving military money to fund the wall. He has very visible deportation facilities. Those are unpopular. There's actually the whole Remain in Mexico policy in part comes from not wanting that imagery of camps, because Americans see camps and they have associations. They don't like to think the deportation
camps in other countries. There's less cameras.
Exactly. And then that keeps going. I'm covering the 2019 Democratic primary at this point, and that whole raised hand, it's just such a great question for Democrats, comes from this discourse saying, how do we prevent this from ever happening again? Well, instead of deportation being a criminal, it's already a civil penalty. What if it's something even less? What if you're allowed to show up and say, I'm demanding asylum because look at how terrible Trump is. This is not America. Emma Lazarus poem, et cetera, et cetera. We need to make sure that no Trump can ever happen again. And that's a lot of the Biden premise in 2020. I'm going to run. Trump will be an aberration. This will never happen again. Part of the never happen again agenda, everyone deserves asylum. And so they got themselves into a very humanitarian, emotional immigration position that they cannot defend. And the result, I mentioned those camps because one thing that Trump is doing in this term, unthinkable last term, going to them, just going to sending Kristi Noem to El Salvador, personally going to Alligator Alcatraz in Florida with this confidence that the country has moved so far towards him on immigration and deportation that they're going to buy, and I have some people, merchandise from the detention camps. So how did Democrats get in that position? They did overreact to Trump, and they didn't come up with their own coherent immigration policy. That was what they were skipping. There was a coherent, you were pointing to it, there was a coherent Obama policy.
Tough on border security, lenient on pathway to citizenship.
A question I like to ask the Democrats I talk to, like the ones who are running for Andy Bashir, I talked to last week, and I'm editing something, is I'll ask who deserves to be here? Like beyond if you're born in America or you're on the process right now of getting naturalized, who else deserves to be an American? And the answers have been, not Bashir's answer was involving, it's about the workforce. Well, even that's not what they were saying in 2019. There were Democrats in Iowa saying, we need immigrants here for the workforce, and that's it. They were saying, hey, if there were people seeking asylum somewhere, I remember Democrats having Trudeau envy because they were watching Justin Trudeau in Canada personally welcome Syrian refugees and saying, what if this country was like that? What if this country was taking in more refugees? We used to be like that. We used to be like that during the Gerald Ford operation that brought people from Vietnam. The country's moved so far right because of the backlash to Biden, and the backlash was engendered by Fox News, et cetera, coverage of the border. what other areas did Democrats not realize that the country's moved away from them? Um, because I do think both parties storytelling is a lot of politics, but I wrote a column up this couple weeks ago. In Democrats' minds, the way history moves is that something outrageous happens and people get up in the streets and protest, and then the people who were defending the outrageous thing crack down on the protesters, and the whole country looks at that and says that can't happen, and they move on. It never happens again. And I'm not trying to impugn Democrats or say like, oh, just in covering them, listening to their rhetoric. A lot of their rhetoric assumes that there's going to be a Selma for the outrage. This is what happened with immigration under Trump. This is what happened under this policy, under this refugee policy. This is what's going to happen for gender-based rights, trans rights, LGBTQ rights. And when it doesn't, they seem not to know what to do with a Republican Party that's very comfortable saying things that make fun of human suffering. I mentioned the detention camps, but there is a level of mockery from the Trump administration that I think borders, or maybe has gotten beyond the border of hubris. They definitely look like a Republican Party that can't imagine losing ever again, which is how you get into trouble.
Right.
They might go back and regret some of the glibness with which they talk about these issues. But Democrats, I think, were just not ready for a cultural shift away from them. And they're looking at these polls and saying, this poll says that Trump's unpopular immigration. But what does that mean? When you come back, it's who deserves to be in the country.
Correct.
When it comes to what does gender mean in the law? There are these tough questions they just punted because they said, well, Trump's unpopular. We're going to go. I'm not trying to ramble. I'm just trying to bring things together. Same thing with gender happened. A lot of the movement on people's acceptance of trans rights was not a lot. Some of it was driven by Trump, by people saying, why is he being so cruel to people who are trans and just want to live their lives, serve the military?
The libertarian, look, Americans are libertarian. Americans have always been libertarian on social issues. Like, even no matter when you push it, both on the right and the left, so that ultimately it's like, hey, don't be cruel to people. Live and let live. Live and let live is mostly usually won out over time, right? The arc of cultural stuff is always bent towards that. And it's sort of like, why is Caitlyn Jenner a Republican? I think people need, like, Democrats ought to ask themselves, why is Caitlyn Jenner a Republican? The live and let live part. But she's not asking to compete in women's sports, right? Like, this is the line the country's at, which is, hey, you live your life how you live your life, but, right? That seems to be where the majority position is. I wonder, is this so famously, Bill Clinton was pro-death penalty at a time when the party was not. And he, of course, infamously put somebody to death, went back. Ricky Rector, I think was his name, my memory serves.
Ricky Ray Rector,
And it's a very uncomfortable story.
I think it was explosive because he didn't need to go back to Arkansas, but he did to sign it.
But he did. Yeah. He wanted everybody to see what he was doing.
Yeah.
I'm going to go out. This was Sister Souljah times 100, if you actually think about it. Sister Souljah gets the sort of the moniker, if you will. But this was actually the moment that sort of said, look, I am a different type of Democrat, right? You are not, I am not soft, right? And that was the fear, right? Are Democrats too soft to lead? Are they too soft to be the leader of the country? Reagan was tough, all that mindset. Jimmy Carter was too soft, right? That was the rep. Dukakis seemed soft. Mondale seemed, whatever that is to people, but there was a softness to them. And Bill, is transgender that issue? Is that how a Democrat is going to try to exploit the stereotype of the left? And is that where we expect, which I know is what the trans community fears, that they're going to be the currency to distance for a Democrat to rebrand themselves, or the party to rebrand themselves.
Well, this is a very active conversation among Democrats that is mostly underground. Again, when I talk about the discourse,
no,
what
I know
do they
it's
say?
the I used to call them nonversations, right? Like the Biden issue. The Biden issue, that was the loudest nonversation for the entire 4 years. Is Kamala Harris really going to be this? Why is there no trust there? And all this. The nonversation was concern about Harris and concern about Biden, right? And yet it wasn't happening in public enough But you and I were having these conversations almost on a daily basis with sources, but nobody was
Yeah.
talking about it, right, in public. It was the non-versation. So
Hmm.
what you're saying is this is today's non-versation.
Yes, and the way that I've heard it from people in the democratic ideas space, and I'm talking about the sorts that they go to donor conferences, they present data. They some of them write columns about it. Again, Rita Share and John Judas are still doing this. They had a book that
Right.
got less attention than the Emerging Democratic Majority that came out in 2022. And it's funny, Emerging Democratic Majority comes out before Democrats are able to win something. Their second book comes out when Democrats have a pretty good midterm, so people keep missing what they're saying.
By the way, that's
There's
his
some of that's
signed
happening.
reading for my How
Yeah.
Washington Works is Roy
Oh yeah.
Teixeira's books, because as one of
Yeah.
my students said, oh my God, I wish I had read this before the 24 election. I would have seen
Yeah.
this coming, you know? Yeah.
Absolutely. But uh, there are this conversation when I was saying the Democrats are kind of coming out and not, and saying something and then not saying something again. Behind the scene, they're talking about this a lot, and uh, I don't. So I'll separate the two things. Immigration will be more important because that it turns out that Trump has forced a conversation on who deserves to be in the country, what does a country mean, what do borders mean, and there are Democrats now saying you can't have a country without borders. Just he has shifted the conversation, his direction on what that means
The era of
to
big
a
government
place
is
that it
over.
was. Yeah.
It's like the
To a
great line of when
yeah.
Bill Clinton said, hey, yeah, the era of big government
Yeah.
is over. Democrats are saying we need a nation with borders.
Yes, and
Yeah,
and
yeah.
just one of the Democrats' problems for how do you convince the swing voter voting B does not mean the border is wide open and anyone can come in. That has
Mhm.
become a problem for them that I think is existential for what the party stands for. I say that because it's happened everywhere. Like look around the world. That has been fatal to center left social democratic parties in Europe.
Is
In
it
Canada,
wasn't this
even the
the
new
warning
liberals have
David
rolled it back. Yeah.
Cameron? David
Yes.
Cameron, we came to the States and said, get tougher on migrants. Trust me.
Yes.
I
Yes.
have firsthand experience. Yeah.
Yes, or you lose the conversation and the far right takes advantage. That is the warning. On the left, they call this choice socialism or barbarism, which is just a good phrase. But what they want is very different than what Democrats are running on. I think that's the problem that they if and when I say they sell that problem, I mean they just need to come out with something that's going to have some group say you guys are terrible racists and you're supporting Trump. Ruben Gallardo of Arizona is kind of led with his chin on this, and as I'm a son of Colombian immigrants, I voted for the Lake and Riley Act. I don't regret voting for it. Some people who are in the country don't deserve to be here. Come at me. But what does that mean as a full policy? Still bring that out. On the gender stuff, that that has been more complicated because the way that they get into this, if I can just quickly, I'm trying to summarize it without being blasé about what happened. But gay marriage, the fight for gay marriage, which we were both covering for years, was very incremental, inch by inch. A lot of Democrats not even committing to endorsing gay marriage, like Barack Obama, until 2012.
By the way,
And
Human
yeah,
Rights Campaign's board was divided about,
yeah,
after the shellacking that
hmm
gay marriage took at the ballot box in '04,
hmm
there was a divide inside HRC
yes,
among some of its big donors. Hey, should we sort of hold back on marriage and instead focus on gay rights protections, in the workplace, civil unions? Let's go down that road. People seem to be good with that. Like there was a real, and it was a 51-49 proposition about how much to go into the
yeah.
fight for same-sex marriage now versus fight for same-sex marriage later, right? And that was a divide. By the way, similar divide on trans issues inside HRC, though I see that
hmm
they've moved past that debate a little bit.
They have, although you can still walk past the HRC headquarters in DC, and it has the big signs that are about trans rights, etc. But just I'm slowly walking through the way that they built this was Democrats it was trench warfare. Democrats and the groups. There were defeats, and one thing I've asked conservatives who on the trans issue, the ones who believe that they're winning this, they can win on it everywhere, is why didn't you guys try to put on the ballot in some states? Hey, this state now defines gender as two sexes,
Huh.
man and female.
Boy, that's a great
And
question. Why hasn't that
yeah,
happened?
well, they one thing is that they think just even some of them are too young to remember 2004 when they went on the gay
Mm.
marriage referenda, but they assumed they'd be outspent on these. They assumed they would not win as many as they did. They also had trouble convincing the party that it mattered. And the story of the right on this up to 2020 was that their donors didn't understand why this was such a big deal. The Caitlyn Jenner coming out in 2015, in the context of the 2016 Republican race, you can find Republicans at the time, like Rick Santorum, saying, "Well, Caitlyn Jenner says she's a woman. She's a woman. Sure." They didn't understand. They didn't
Well,
understand
she
how
was
this
also
could be political.
Republican. There was
She
a
was
weird
Republican,
part of
yeah.
that. You wonder if she had been a high-profile Democrat, if the
Mhm.
conversation would have been the same. Just a
Oh,
thought.
maybe, but just the way it was seen as a libertarian issue, it's like, why do you
Mhm.
want the Republican Party
Right.
that just got killed on gay marriage after, and we can't even talk about it anymore? Why do you want us to get involved in this? And Democrats had the same set of facts, like, well, we make gay marriage move so slowly that now we're kind of embarrassed that we move so slowly. There was a very brief news cycle in 2015 because Hillary Clinton had been Secretary of State and wasn't taking political positions. How come she hadn't endorsed gay marriage yet? And the Trump campaign had some fun with Donald Trump endorsed gay marriage before Hillary Clinton did. So the trans issues, the history is quite complicated. I recommend reading Susan Stryker's book on transgender history to catch up on this stuff. Um, they are different movements that are interlocking. They have fight.
Totally.
They want different things. But the way that this got in, the Obama administration and Biden administration said, well, no, these are human rights, and we're enforcing them, and we're changing the way that the government's code talks about gender. We are changing the way that healthcare plans cover gender medicine. We're doing that. There's not going to be a debate. There's not going to be referendums in states. It's not going to take forever. We're just doing it because this is right. And then the backlash comes later. I mean, just imagine if because what happened with gay marriage is sometimes a court would legalize it and then there'd be a voter backlash. But imagine if instead, um, Bill Clinton in 1999 says, change the legal code. Marriage now means whatever. No, he didn't. He did DOMA. And so the way the trans rights have played out politically, I think, has been, again, uh, traumatizing to people who are progressives who believe in this, to trans people, because the recent experience is that human rights moves in one direction, and that actually was the the trench warfare of gay marriage was not repeated for trans rights. It was handled differently. Neither party really fully understood the implications. Now I think they've got a good understanding of the implications. There were people trying to find a way through.
Yeah.
But instead, what you're seeing is, because it wasn't just America, UK, European countries have the same thing. All right, we have a new understanding of what gender is. It's enforced in the code, and the backlash came after that. This progressive dealing with a right wing backlash for a lot, because people are cycling through the political process just because of mortality, who don't remember things. I find this as a reporter, people who do not remember
Yeah.
Barack Obama being elected. Certainly, they don't remember a period when gay marriage was unpopular. There are a lot of people in political activism, in Democratic
Right.
politics, and their story is, look, the country is becoming more progressive. Why would you ever question rights for all people, something that's good for all people? Why would you ever do that? How could a Democrat sell people out by saying maybe it's going too fast? Republicans, same. I think they're snake bit by gay marriage, and now, I mean, the degree they move from we're not sure if we should run on this issue to we're going to attack every Democrat over it, again, I think seems hubristic, because in those spaces I'm talking about, the
Right.
Democratic donor spaces, one thing they're saying is courts might take care of this, and that's like a very
I
if
know what
this
you
is
mean by
affecting
that.
your life,
Right.
and it's affecting your life, that's a little hard to hear. They're saying, look, Scarametti happened. There's going to be there are going to be more
Right.
cases before a 6-3 Supreme Court. The next time a Democrat's going to run for office, if Republicans say hey, they're
Right.
going to do this, they'll say, no, it's already illegal. That's terrible to hear if you're progressive. That's like saying, well, the courts have handled Roe v. Wade. Stop running on abortion in Texas. It's over. You just what's your frame of reference as a progressive for,
If
look, we lost that
yeah,
one. We're never going to get it back.
if you have to solve one, if you have to sort of run against the party on, you have to pick one of those two issues to run against the party on hard.
Hmm.
My sense is immigration's the one that voters care about more. The
Yes.
trans issue is sort of like an exclamation point,
Hmm.
and they're in favor of, and they're
Hmm.
this, right? Like, and you can weather that if that's your only demerit. You can say,
Hmm.
look how pathetic my opponent is being. He's obsessed with looking under people's skirts. If that is your only quote unquote violation to the
Hmm.
cultural center, right? I
Yeah.
don't think you can be tough on trans folks and soft on immigration and think that's going to solve your problems. If you're going to pick one of these cultural hot button issues to run against the party on, it feels like immigration is probably the smarter play if you're just playing tactically.
Yeah, and it I agree with that. I also, for all the reasons we just talked about, for the way courts
Yeah.
are going to handle it, it's also, like I was saying, within the party and the polyglot of influences it has right now. If you come out and say, "Look, I'm for deporting people who
Right.
committed a crime," you don't get the same backlash as you do if you say, I mean, I was like, I mean, Andy Bashir. Another thing I asked him was about um, the Trump's orders on gender medicine for minors, and he said, "Well, I'm against surgeries on minors, and I always have been." And I guess like that didn't get a reaction anymore. But it's the what also affects more people's lives. I think this is going
That's
to be
exactly right.
this is going
It's
to be part
about
of it. Yeah.
1% versus 30% of the country.
But oh, sorry, you're the host, and
No, no, no,
I
no.
keep
I think this was no, no, no. We spent a good chunk here. That was
yeah,
the
yeah.
big picture.
But yeah, my
Now
only
it's
point
sort
of
of
it is that
like,
Democrats like need to figure out what they believe and talk about it,
right.
as opposed to
And
say,
where are
I
we
believe
now?
history is moving this way, and I'll get right with history. They just need to say,
Right.
why do I believe this? Yeah.
Let's talk about where we're going to see some of these fights play out, right? Like at
Hmm.
the ballot box in some of these primaries. Um, Look, we can have the Mamdani conversation. I'm of I think that there is a long history of urban voters willing to flirt with socialism because there's a demand for cities there always is more of a expectation and a demand for city services than there is for state or federal, right? That there is
Hmm.
this sort of, so like, the fact is, when have we elected socialists in this country? Most of the elections have taken place in mayor's races, whether it's the mayor of
Hmm.
Burlington, the mayor of Milwaukee, we may have a mayor of Minneapolis, the mayor of New York City. So I am skeptical that's as transferable
Hmm.
into the rest of the party. And I expect most of the party to feel comfortable distancing themselves from Mamdani, in some sort of, oh, I like him, he's a good campaigner, but that's not what I'm for,
Hmm.
or hostile. But it will be some form of that. You concur with that, or do you think it could have more legs?
Uh, I I concur. I think Republicans are very quick to say we're going to tie every Democrat to Mamdani, but this rang hollow because Eric Adams was supposed to be the savior of Democrats' brand in cities, and Republicans swept
Right.
all these New York suburban seats are running against Eric Adams anyway.
Right.
So that's also I try to play it straight, and if everyone agrees that Democrats need to run for something, not against something, I'm not convinced that a midterm message for the incumbent party that runs everything will be, "Hey, look at that guy in New York." Uh,
Yeah.
Now, I've known Mamdani for a while. I talked to him in the race for mayor, but I met him when he was running for state senate. In New York, the rise of DSA in New York, the story of socialists until Mamdani over the last couple of years is that they were losing ground. And they were losing ground both for the
Hmm.
reasons that a lot of left wing or groups lose ground, infighting, and people quit, and people lob accusations at each other. But also they were getting blamed for a lot of policies that they advanced, like bail
Hmm.
reform, more of the criminal policies. Socialists were
Criminal
not getting
justice.
dinged.
Right.
Yes, so socialists were not getting dinged for their economic ideas. They were getting hurt for the other ideas about remaking society, prison abolition, eh, police abolition. Defunding police is downstream from that. And Mamdani didn't run on that. Mamdani ran on affordability.
Right.
So I I feel the one way I view what he did is more he's like the Howard Jarvis of housing affordability. Howard Jarvis, passes this ballot initiative in California in the 70s on tax limitation that redefines the state, but
Prop
Democrats don't see
13.
Prop
Yeah.
13, but Democrats don't see it coming because they thought they were being responsible stewards of the taxpayers' money and saving up for a big surplus and not refunding people's money with taxes. And in New York, there was a lot of denial. Like, well, I mean, yeah, the housing thing is slow, but we need to work through these groups, and we're going to build
Hmm.
this housing, but this donor's opposed to it. And Mamdani, there's been this fight for who owns this agenda between more moderate Democrats and progressives, because they do want to be the party of affordability. It just means different stuff in different places. I mean, you mentioned
Right.
Minneapolis, and housing affordability is less of an issue in Minneapolis because it's not as expensive. It's just not as expensive to live there. New York, Los Angeles. Um, mean, you could really start there at DC area. Are
Yeah.
just if you're when you're done with this podcast, go look up Zillow and look up
Right.
what it costs to have a big family home in those places. You're not going to have the same issues outside of urban
Right.
areas. So he is for urban Democrats like Howard
Right.
Jarvis figure saying, look, if you don't deal with this, voters are going to react and make you deal with it, and they're
Oh,
going to demand higher
I
prices,
look.
more housing, etc. Go ahead. Sorry.
My test on Mamdani is Mikey Sherrill. If
Yeah.
somehow she loses, I think there will be this idea that there's a Mamdani effect and that hurt her in the
Yeah.
northern Jersey suburbs, right? Like that's the scenario. I had an interview with Rahm Emanuel a couple weeks ago, and that was
Mhm.
his paranoia. That does Mamdani become a problem? Can Chitterelli in New Jersey weaponize Mamdani and weaponize New York City essentially against Mikey Sherrill and make her own that a little bit? I'll watch and see. Right? I don't,
Mhm.
we'll find out. I think I'm fascinated with New Jersey governor because I think it's the only. I don't think Virginia's going to be, because of the federal worker issue, really more than anything else, is
Yeah.
such a problem for Republicans. They can complain all they want about the lieutenant governor's campaign. Please, it's Donald Trump and the and Doge that is
Oh yeah.
that is going to put Abigail Spanberger in Richmond there.
Yeah.
Um, so let's move to 2016. And if
Mhm.
you had I'm going to answer it first, and I'm curious if there's any other state that I think the most interesting state to understand where the country is headed, where the Democratic Party is headed, is the state of Michigan. You
Yeah.
have a Democratic primary and Senate that is going to pit sort of establishment DC versus sort of younger outsider state senator, right? And Molly McMorrow versus Haley Stevens. And then you have the three-way race for governor, which is going to test sort of where is the middle, what is mainstream left versus the center versus, frankly, John James being mainstream right. I mean, I find it, and whether there is a centrist or a sort of non-major party movement that can actually get traction, right, beyond that. So I look at the state of Michigan and both the governor's race and the Senate race, and I just see it as having all of the national storylines. We're trying to figure out the future of the Democrats, what's going on with this sort of continued 10-year rise of people not aligning with either party, particularly among voters under 45, and that Michigan has it all. Um,
Mhm.
I know you concur about Michigan being important. Is it the be all end all? Do you see it that same way? Is there other states that you would put in that category for 2026 as sort of being nearly the most intriguing and most important potential ways to sort of decipher what might happen in 28?
No, I like that as the focal point. I would not. There not any sort of. I would say Nevada is going to be interesting because as a test of how fluky, and Texas and Nevada will be interesting as a test of whether the move towards Trump by Latino voters was situational for 2024 or whether it represents something long term, and just that's not as much of a factor in Michigan. Uh, if both of them, I'm glad you said that too, because I think unless something changes, I'm going to Michigan on Saturday, so I'm glad it's important.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
but
it's got air. I mean, I've been there
yeah,
twice already myself, and it's
yeah.
like I hope every time I'm like, man, boy, this is where I'd open a bureau here if I were the hotline, type of
No,
thing. Like I think
completely.
it's that
And
important.
I'd mention, yeah, there's a third candidate in the well, there's four candidates in the Senate race. Abdul El-Sayed, who Bernie Sanders endorsed
Hmm.
day one,
That's right. I forgot
who
about
yeah,
him. Yes.
and Joe Tate, the former Speaker of the state house, who's interesting. He's also kind of as a storytelling figure, sort of interesting because he was the first Black Democratic Speaker of the state house in Michigan, and Michigan Democrats finally won this trifecta in 2022, and then they didn't do as much as other Democrats did with their trifecta. And there's not much excitement around Joe Tate because where was the agenda? Where was the Great Whitmer
Mhm.
agenda that she could compare to um, what Tim Walz did in Minnesota or what Kathy
Mhm.
Hochul did in New York, etc. And so Tate has not gotten much momentum. Abdul has gotten some of that progressive interest. And yes, Moro is running more as an anti. I agree with you because the stories they're all telling are very interesting. The
Yes, they
reason
are.
that the Moro people's theory of the case is he is uh, leading edge of the suburban state Michigan revival from the suburbs of Detroit. The suburbs of Detroit is a big place. And she's been doing this work in Michigan, not in DC. Their theory is being connected to DC and Democrats flopping around and failing is not going to be a winner for Haley Stevens. The Stevens theory is more that she gets things done. She can work with both parties. Is that
She's
still
Gary
the way you can
Peters.
get ahead?
Yeah.
Yeah, is that she's Gary Peters or she's Alyssa Slotkin to an extent. And
Yeah.
the Syed al-Sayed theory is Democrats were not inspiring enough. They're not straightforward enough for what they believe. Say what they think. Call out day one I interviewed him, and he calls what's happening in Israel and Gaza a genocide. Do that. His theory, and that's a very powerful strain of progressive thinking. True progressivism has not been tried. The Democratic establishment never let Bernie get the nomination, so we've never got to see how. Put a progressive in there, and you're going to wake up.
Correct me if
the
I'm wrong.
white working class.
Bernie won Michigan primaries twice, right?
No, he won the first one, and he got smoked in 2020.
The
Which
2020
was,
he did not win because Michigan has in the past. Jesse Jackson won the Michigan primary back in the day.
Yes.
There's always been this interesting, weird, progressive, and part of it is there's no party registration, I think, and you
Yes.
can go on either side, so you can sort of momentum candidates can pull upsets in Michigan in ways that
Yeah. This is one of my favorite unkillable debates inside the party is because Bernie never got the nomination. Who was the Bernie voter, and how much could he have been a Bernie instead of a Trump voter? And they never got a chance to prove it. They never will. But in Michigan is one of those places. New Hampshire primary was the first place where this started to pop up because Bernie kills Hillary in New Hampshire, biggest landslide in the history of the primary. He runs 4 years later. He's better known. He does much worse. He wins the primary, but barely, because it turns out a lot of his voters just like, no, I'm independent and I hate Hillary. Same thing happened in Michigan. Biden wins every county in the state because a lot of the Bernie voters they hated Hillary. How many of them would have come out for Bernie had he been the nominee? How many of
we don't know
voted for Trump?
Right.
We don't know. And I think it's very fair to progressives to say, that's right. You never have to test that particular kind of campaign. And the Abdul al-Sayed theory is, I'll do it. I'm going to test this campaign. I'm going to run as a Bernie populist in Michigan. And the McMorrow theory is more, I'm going to run as the Buttigieg generational change outsider candidate. And the Stevens theory is, look, Gary Peters won. I can win. And so, very different theories of how the party works. And I needed to spend time out with them because the thing they all have in common is they're really not attracting new people. They're not finding those voters who got disaffected by Democrats in the last few years and now have found somebody inspiring. And I think that does come down to policy. And I think it comes down to more immigration than anything else, because that's one thing you hear a lot talking to the non-white voters who were Democrats and voted for Obama and then voted for Trump. A thing that comes up very frequently is, I work for what I have, and then the Democrats gave free hotels to all the illegal immigrants.
Yeah.
Boom. How much did it hurt the party that they were seen as the party, not just of not giving things away to people, because we're talking about the 80s. This is the crisis of the 80s. The Democrats are the party of handing out welfare and tanking the economy. How much of this, and it's over?
The welfare queen, the welfare queen image of the 80s became the free migrant hotel guys in New York in 2022.
And how much I think that's less of a factor in Michigan, but I did hear some of that in the Detroit area. I vote for the Democrats, but they never do anything for us. It seems like all they care about is illegal immigrants.
If Mike Duggan wins the governorship, what does that mean?
That would be, I think, be a victory for he will have beaten the Democratic and Republican candidates, most successful
very good
independent
ones.
since
By
Bernie
the way,
Sanders. Very good ones.
Very good one. This is not a case. Usually when the third party candidate has a shot, there's a flawed nominee, but there's no obvious flaw in Jocelyn Benson among Democrats. There's no obvious flaw among John James. If anything, both of them, Benson feels like a rightful heir to Whitmer, and John James feels like the new Republican Party that they're trying to sell, right? And here comes Mike Duggan, sort of rumply old white guy, mayor of Detroit, right?
Yeah.
Sort of, I'm going to turn your streetlights on and fill your potholes kind of guy. sort of technocratic, right? Sort of Bloomberg without the nice suits.
Hmm.
And that's I don't know if that's going to work outside of the Detroit metro area, which is my curiosity. He does really well in his media market. He's much less known, obviously, in the rest of the state. Um, but that's my curiosity: is if he wins, what does it mean, and what does it mean for Democrats more so than it is for Republicans? Because to me, this would be more of a statement against the Democrats than it would be, because one would assume by the general, Whitmer's out there trying to help Jocelyn Benson be the heir apparent.
Yes, that is an underrated. That's another reason Michigan's worth watching because Democrats have their map and their theory of what's going to happen across the
Mm-hmm.
country, and where does this fit in? Where does it fit in that um, they because what play it out like if they lose the Michigan governor's mansion to John James, he's an instantly favorite for vice president in 2028, favorite
Yes, he
for
is.
president at some point, without doing anything. I mean, he just be in that position. I mean, he
Yeah,
ran for Senate twice and lost with that theory. As soon as we swing state, a black elected Republican,
right.
he's gonna be in the mix with
Swing state
veteran
black
every.
Republican. It's like Ruben Gallego, swing state
Yes,
Hispanic Democrat. He's going to be on every
yes.
list.
So there
Right.
will the intense Democratic interest in stopping that from happening, and the most recent experience we have of this is Democrats is trying to shut down the third party candidate and deny them support, deny them consultants, etc. Duggan's been polling pretty well. The thing that I think they haven't panicked yet because in polling, Benson has still been winning. James is not a runaway favorite. He's never
Mm-hmm.
he's outperformed when I think he ran a bit behind Trump in 2020. Yes, ran behind Trump in 2020, outperformed 2018. But the state is not on fire for John James, and being a Republican House member is the least effective part of his
Correct me if I'm
resume.
wrong.
Yeah,
Republicans haven't been able to win statewide in Michigan. I'm trying. I
2014.
mean, right? Rick Schneider. That's the last one.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
Democrats Democrats have swept everything except the presidential in 2020. I'd
16,
say
2016 and
16 and
2024.
24.
Right.
And those are big ifs, and those are big but fors, but really it's yeah, Democrats
But
sweep
they can't win
in
any of the statewide
18,
races.
Democrats sweep in 2022, and
Right.
Democrats win every state Supreme Court race. Every time it's not Trump on the ballot, Democrats sweep. You're right.
Well, what's interesting about what's going on, and this was, and I know we're getting up on an hour, and
Mm.
I'm very mindful of that, but I have a feeling we could go on for a long time. But it is
Sure.
interesting about the difference, and this was another theme I wanted to hit with you on the midterms, that I think what makes 2018 different, what makes 2026 potentially different from 2018 is you have a more unified Republican Party. So,
Mm.
right, Mitch McConnell was not interested in the same candidates that Donald Trump's team was interested in for Senate races. This
Hmm.
time, John Thune and the Trump team are working in tandem, and they're really the only disagreement going right now, arguably, is Georgia. I mean,
Hmm.
we can have a conversation about Louisiana, but that's a separate issue. In Texas, those are sort of unique to the incumbents. But as far as essentially, and it's really Brian Kemp and the DC folks that are in disagreement about Georgia. Um, Look at how quickly everybody shut down primaries in Michigan. Look how quickly a primary was shut down in North Carolina. Look how quickly, like this is how quickly a primary was shut down in Florida for that Senate seat. It does, I see a Republican Party for the first time in the Trump era rowing in the same direction as far as tactics are concerned. That's worth something. And Democrats have overperformed thanks to Republican infighting that may not be there in 26.
Hmm.
That's worth what? 5 seats in the House? Is that worth a Senate seat or two? What's your sense on that?
It would have been in the past, because sometimes Trump just chooses worse candidates, even despite the infighting.
Right.
And
Almost out of it, really touch the hot stove. Don't touch it.
yeah,
I'm gonna sleep on the hot stove. Forget touching
yeah.
it.
But it's the point is getting people who have his vision. The JD Vance example in Ohio is definitive, obviously because of where he ended up is would Mike Dolan have won more easily than JD Vance in 2022?
Of
Yeah,
course.
probably. What would that have gotten Trump though? Just a conservative senator who breaks with him on Ukraine and doesn't
And tariffs.
like, yeah, and tariffs. And no, he got somebody who
He already had a Rob Portman. He didn't want another Rob Portman.
he got a zealous convert who's with him on everything. So is it worth? I mean, Jim DeMint had this quote, especially I think this quote got blown up because this was at the height of the Mitch McConnell Senate wars, where he wanted to discredit Jim DeMint and the conservatives, but DeMint said he'd rather have uh, he'd rather have
30, right? Isn't it 30 like-minded? Yeah.
Like-minded senators and 60 wimpy Republicans, and they said, that's a loser mentality. We don't want 30, but it turns out 53 Republicans, of whom 2 of them want to break with Trump on some things, turns out to get you everything you want. You can still get your Mitch McConnell gets to vote against some nominees and give a statement about it, and Tom Tillis gets to do his interviews where he says he has a problem with Trump, but you mostly get what you want. It turns out, and this is the experience Democrats had. It turns out, I mean, really had like Cal Cunningham. She just kept it in his pants in 2020, and they had one more Senate seat in 2021. Trillions more dollars could have passed, and not because it didn't require Bill the party. Just
they didn't need Joe Manchin, right? How badly do you need Joe Manchin's vote, right?
Yes,
Donald Trump doesn't need Lisa Murkowski's vote and doesn't need Susan Collins's vote, right? He has put himself in a position where the swing votes are now Mitch McConnell and Tom Tillis and Bill Cassidy. He'll take that any day of the week. Yeah.
But will he get involved less? Because really, Ossoff is it. Ossoff is the only Democrat running for re-election to the Senate. In Michigan, he's been pretty successful. He didn't. People think he cleared the field for Mike Rogers in 2024 rather. He didn't quite. There still were people who kept running against Mike Rogers. Just didn't matter because Trump endorsed him. So he will get the candidates he wants, and it's really those kind of Rogers guys who genuflect to Trump and are willing to support whatever he does, even if they have some other appeal beyond Trump. That's the sweet spot. They're going to find some of those. They have not found one in North Carolina. They have not found one in Georgia. I don't know who they could. I'm not just going down the entire list of people in Georgia, but they did get very fixated on Brian Kemp. And once he decided not to do it, can they find somebody whose brand is independent of Trump, but also endorsed by Trump? They don't have somebody obviously in that zone.
I am surprised, and I think Brian Kemp is too, that the Trump folks are not as interested in Derek Dooley. I think Derek Dooley is a smart idea because I think being an incumbent is a demerit, R or D this year. And more importantly, being a congressman is a demerit. And if I were John Ossoff, I'd love to run against somebody whose first name is congressman versus somebody whose first name is coach. Okay.
If it's Mike Collins, it's congressman who's a son of a congressman. Like I can write those ads.
Yeah, no. And so I'm surprised that the Chris Lasavitas and the Tony Fabrizios, who right now do have the presidency ear on some of these things, and Blair, the political director, don't see the value in Coach Dooley versus Congressman Collins. On that front,
it's the best intro, the best bio for candidates. I'm an independent businessman, and like Donald Trump, I'm fed up with the establishment, and I'm going to take it to Washington. Absolutely, and there are those people throughout these states. It's just who of them can. Because podcasts are actually good training for some of this. The guys who can go on and kind of riff for an hour, and turns out they don't sound like schmucks about politics. Those guys, I think, always need to be in the mix. Hey, there's this guy who's on CNBC all the time. He might run for Senate. Yeah. I'm
going to push my envelope here a little bit, but I'm going to try to do lightning round. Let's try to finish up in 7 minutes. Tennessee special in December. Percentage chance that becomes a special election we all care about come December 2nd, because it may show something. This is a little bit of suburbs of Nashville. It has all the makings. I look at it as, if Democrats can't make it interesting, I actually see that as a yellow flag for the midterm. What say you? Am I overrating it?
Do you want it a chance? I'd say 50% chance. I think that's another state where Republicans have run it for so long and they're so hubristic. And Andy Ogles is the guy who won the other safe seat they drew out when they carved up Nashville, and he's mediocre. If they get a mediocre candidate, Democrats will have a good one. Yeah, I'd say 50-50.
I could see that becoming like a 5-point race, and everybody's like, whoa, right? Like, I don't expect Democrats to win it. I'm talking about that you're like, they've got to do something. Second thing is, other than Rand Paul and Glenn Youngkin, have you seen anybody else on the Republican 2028 presidential primary trail? Like I said, Paul's out there. He's decided. It's pretty clear to me he's decided he's running, and
Hmm.
Youngkin obviously went to Iowa. Um, and then of course there's Kristi Noem's obvious campaign on cosplay primary, but in there's this sub primary of the Trump cabinet, right? Vance, Rubio, Noem, you know, and I throw Howard Lutnick in there. I think he's gonna. I think he's got an ego that is just only going to grow. Um, but who else? Have you seen anybody else that I haven't, like, I expect Josh Hawley to run for president, but I haven't seen him do the things that somebody would be doing right now to run for president.
No, there was a float around Mike Braun, who just got elected governor of
He
Indiana,
shot it down
and
pretty fast, didn't he?
that was shot down very quickly. I've not seen anyone else getting into that mix. Even the Trump kids, they'll get polled. Not
Yeah.
really. I feel that it's not because they're afraid of Trump stepping in and defending JD Vance and attacking them. I just haven't seen it yet. No, you're not missing anything. I've not seen a Republican that we've not heard of get in and put himself out as somebody that donors might want to be interested in. They might be underplaying it because it's I think Vance is a strong vice president in that position,
Yeah.
but not invincible and does not have the independent appeal of Trump. So Youngkin, I mean, not surprising that the former Carlyle group guy is being entrepreneurial.
Right.
But nobody else yet.
No, I mean, it's like I could picture a primary field that looked a lot like 2016 Democrats, like 4 or 5
Mhm,
people only, an obvious front runner, and then somebody that catches fire that you don't expect, right? If you
mhm,
told me Vance Paul was a really close primary,
mhm,
I wouldn't be totally blown away. I'd be more surprised if it were Vance Youngkin having
mhm.
a dueling it out. Youngkin is such an on paper candidate, and I've seen those guys implode in the past. Maybe I'm wrong, but
Hey,
I'm not as sold in him. Paul, I never
no.
underestimate. I never underestimate the Paul family. They have a following that's durable.
And I will see the conditions are, but look, how much are Republican voters actually going to care
Correct.
about the debt in 2028 after another few trillion are
Oh,
thrown onto it? Yeah,
right.
I see openings for him. I don't know the foreign policy situation. Trump overpromised what he was going to get done. I see
Yeah.
it. I see some openings, but you really, in a world where Trump won the midterms, partly through the Texas gerrymandering, harder to see. In a world where Trump and Vance are on defense for next 2 years. I mean, go back to George Bush in '88,
Right.
who really had trouble locking that nomination down when he was the
But
heir
then he
apparent
didn't.
to a very popular president, and they got
Right.
it.
But he was always going to get the benefit of the doubt. He was still Ronald
Yeah,
Reagan's vice president, and Bob Dole wasn't. He was still Ronald Reagan's vice president, and Jack Kemp wasn't. Right. I've
yeah.
always said that should have been Jack Kemp's nomination. He was the true heir apparent to the Reagan. If you talk to anybody that worked in the Reagan White House, they viewed Kemp as the true heir apparent. That doesn't mean
Hmm.
you can voters see the words vice president and think, oh, I'm okay with that.
Hmm.
Um, on and let me get you out of here on this because I think it has to do potentially. Why do you think there's so many interested Democrats in running for Iowa Senate? Like, of all places where we're seeing, and they're all, what's interesting about the 4 candidates, 3 are already
Hmm.
in, one is pondering, they're all kind of the same candidate. They're running
Hmm.
as new types of Democrats. They're on the younger side. Um, they're culturally less progressive and liberal, right? It's fascinating to
Yeah.
me. And you're like, guys, shouldn't one of you run for state treasury and one of you run for the attorney general or one of you run for an open house seat in the fourth or whatever it is? What do you make of that? Is that all because, like, I do sense Republican fatigue in the governor's mansion, right? I think
Hmm.
Rob Sand has all the markings of Charlie Baker in Massachusetts or Laura Kelly in Kansas, right? Where, yeah, there's sort of, or Andy Beshear in Kentucky. Yeah, hey, that guy's, not too liberal. He's not one of those national Democrats. Let's let him govern things. I don't like this education policy it's education that I think is the real sort of the issue that if Rob Sand wins, that's why he ends up winning. But it's a head scratcher to me about the Senate race, other than I assume they think that she's not running.
Yeah, they that's safe. Although most Democrats I've talked to, and this includes the Senate candidates, do think she was a more clear target than Ashley Hinson, who they expect would run for the seat.
Mm-hmm.
The former TV
And if
reporter
she
who
runs for
ran
the
for
seat, I
Congress. Yeah,
bet you one or two of those Senate Democratic candidates jump in the Ashley Hinson seat for what it's worth.
I think does he live? I'm thinking because Walls lives in Iowa City. I think he's in Miller Meets's. Well,
Yeah,
then
that
I'm
doesn't.
good.
You know how that doesn't
Let's end
matter.
on an exciting redistricting conversation.
Yeah,
No,
yeah, yeah, right.
yeah, you're right.
Iowa City
I
goes
think they
back
might
and forth
revisit,
between whether it's in the first or the second, depending on who got the short straw
but
on the Republican
I think
gerrymander.
I think it's one a factor of the party's decline, and there's no one in the party who can say run for this, not that. Two,
Right.
that's the Sand's factor because Sand, the Republicans really I mean, if he does run and win, it'll remind me a bit when Republicans gerrymandered out Joe Connolly and forced him to run for Senate, which he won in Indiana because Republicans went on a tear just taking away Rob Sand's powers. And he said, "Oh, well, there's
Oh,
nothing for me to run for as auditor anymore. I'm just going to run for governor."
oh,
And
and he's
he,
been
yeah,
using fiscal conservatism arguments. They don't. I
yeah.
mean, he's he's running on a message that Rahm Emanuel would champion back in '06. Run on corruption. Run on, saving people money. Sort of run on sort of bread and butter issues. Again,
Mhm.
that's what's available to them. And then you throw in the fact that Kim Reynolds. It's funny. I assume she's not running because she made MAGA so mad by endorsing DeSantis.
Yeah,
And that is still a hangover inside the Republican Party in Iowa a little bit. But
yeah.
it is fascinating to me. You're just like, wow, Democrats are struggling as a party, but somehow they have four reasonably decent Senate candidates showing up in Iowa. All of them are
Mhm.
interesting on paper candidates. The guy in Council Bluffs, the Chamber of Commerce guy, the baseball player, right? Like they all have interesting I think a Republican seat in a special. So they all have their story. They're like four Molly McMorrows, if you will,
Mhm.
out of there. So it's just
Yeah.
it is another one where it makes me want to go to the state fair this year. And state fair's in about a week.
And with Gallego stopping by. No, I think so. Remember, Iowa has that rule where if nobody gets more than 35% in the primary, they go
Oh, I
certify they go to
know. I
convention.
think that's gonna,
Yeah,
and if all these stay in, that is the irony, is it'll be a bunch of insiders that decide this
yeah.
primary result.
Somebody might be convinced that they would be better off running because I think ag is one that Democrats have come close on before. Uh,
Mhm.
but how do you? Sand is the kind of now he didn't in 2022, but DeSantis brought this up. But Iowa and Florida were this archipelago of states where there was a red wave, and that was in part because Democrats just
Mhm.
gave up on Iowa and
They just
ran
gave up,
did
and
deeper.
Democrats gave up on Florida. Right? It was
Yeah.
dual. It was more of surrender than it was accomplishment. But yeah.
So this will be the first time they will have had since Fred Hubble in 2018 a real
Mhm.
candidate with real sources, and unlike Fred Hubble, who is running as a very culturally liberal, let's protect abortion candidate, Sand is very different in ways you set up. Yeah, they're going to compete for it. There's also a little bit of this is their last chance to convince Democrats to maybe give them back a caucus.
Oh, I think
If
if
they have a
Sand
Democratic governor,
wins,
it's a little harder. Oh yeah,
yeah, I think if Sand wins, Iowa's first in the nation again. I do, and I
yeah.
think the Democratic Party. I think they were idiots to get out of Iowa because when you
Mhm.
look at the problem the party has talking to rural voters, well, making all your candidates learn how to talk to rural voters might be a good idea in the first presidential primary state. Just just a
Yeah,
thought.
although what ended up happening is the one thing that cooled them on it was who was turning up for the caucuses was the most progressive Democrats. So they said, "Hey, was it a good idea to go around here and promise to stop all deportations?" Because that's what I kept getting yelled
I
at to
hear
do
you,
when I
but
was in Iowa City.
their best messenger, a guy named Pete Buttigieg, was the only one
That's
that
right.
was campaigning in Eastern Iowa, and he arguably, we can debate on who won Iowa, but he basically got there because he went to places that Democrats had stopped going to.
I think I heard Bernie Sanders say enough times the winner of the popular vote in Iowa, so he won the popular vote. Let's give him that. Yeah.
Dave Weigel, what is your favorite state fair food? You're one of the few campaign reporters that truly travels the country a lot. You've probably been
Mhm.
to more than just the Iowa State Fair. Iowa State Fair, Minnesota State Fair, that's a big rivalry. Indiana State Fair, the three of them think they have the best state fairs. Have you been to all three?
I've been to Iowa and Minnesota, and Minnesotans like to say, actually, you political reporters don't realize that we have the best state fair. And I'll say, no, you do. And so I've definitely the Minnesota
Well,
one
wherever
is
I
I'll take it over
go,
Iowa. Yeah,
right, wherever I go, I will say it's the best state fair.
yeah, yeah.
I'll suck up to the locals. Don't get me wrong, but you've been to
Yes.
both. Which one is it, Minnesota or Iowa?
I'd say Minnesota also, remember, like, no disrespect to Iowa food, but Minnesota has that Andrew Zimmern tradition, and they will always have not just the experimental fair food, but the fair experimental fair food that like you would order it on menu anywhere. Yeah. So I've um like the fusion Somalian
Oh, yeah.
sorts of food that you do not expect. Yeah,
That's
Minnesota.
fun.
They change when they change the fare. They change it every year. I will always get some cheese curds because I try to avoid fried stuff, but that a hot cheese curd in fresh frying oil, unbeatable. But that's boring. There's usually a much more exciting one once you get there. That competition that they had every year for the best new experimental food. Just Minnesota is 1,000 years ahead of everybody in the
Wow. So
experimenting.
if you're a foodie, Minnesota's the call, is what you're
Yeah,
saying.
Minnesota's the one. Yeah,
Oh man. All right. I'll be very curious. This is the weird type of thing that I'll get a lot of feedback about. Right? We won't get any
Good.
feedback about all the conversation we had about trans issues. No, 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 no. The state fair conversation. People will be more passionate about that. But I love it for a foodie. And you can go on YouTube if anybody really wants to see. I did 1 year at the Iowa State Fair. I tried one of everything. We did an experiment and I put it on YouTube. If your stomach can hack it, you can take a look at that. Dave Weigel, if you don't subscribe to his newsletter, as I did with Ben Smith, I think the Semafor newsletters, number one, they don't make you pay. They're all free.
That's right.
Thank you. Like for us independent media operations, we don't like to spend too much subscription money. We spend subscription money. I subscribe to a lot of papers, don't get me wrong, but it's free. It's fantastic. And as I said, Dave, the fact that we've never worked together is a bummer to me. But I appreciate you coming on the pod.
Well, this counts. This is a podcast collaboration, so we finally
There you go.
did
Well, I'm
something
going to
together.
bring you back because there's political reporters who travel and there's political reporters, and you travel. I know you're on the ground and you bring a lot of nuance to your reporting, which I think, frankly, strategists on both sides of the aisle respect a ton. And that matters a lot. So good work,
Thanks.
my friend.
Thanks so much. It was a real pleasure to do this. Thanks. I'm glad we can make it work. Yeah.
You got it, brother. Thanks.